Hi, welcome. My name is Rachel and I work at the Brookfield Library. And I'm so pleased to welcome everyone to tonight's program. We have Matt Austin, who is the Director of Education, Training, and Outreach at the Women's Center of Greater Danbury. And he's going to share welcome. My name is a presentation with us this evening, on sexual violence. So we're very pleased to have you here. And okay, take it away, Matt.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I am Matt Austin. I'm the Director of Education, Training, and Outreach at the Women's Center of Greater Danbury. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm going to share my PowerPoint, but I'll do it now. All right. So tonight we're going to talk about sexual violence. This has been an ongoing every month or so. We've been doing these programs. We did domestic violence and women's center services, and we got a couple more coming up. So tonight we're going to talk about sexual violence. It's important for those watching to take care of yourself. Some of this stuff can be sensitive. If at any point you need to shut it off, etc., walk away. Am I right, Rachel, in that it's going to be archived on the YouTube?
Oh, yes. I'm so sorry I didn't mention that. Yes, we are going to be recording and it will be on our YouTube page.
Perfect. That's great. Yeah, so it'll be on the YouTube page. Somebody today asked me if it was appropriate for their high schooler. And I said, we do a version of this program that's not too different than this program in a lot of the high schools around here. But if you're watching tonight and you want to show it to your child or high school, take a look, watch it through today and see if it's appropriate for them. That was the advice I gave when I was asked today, is watch it and judge. You know your child better than I know your child. So anyway, we are here talking about sexual violence. Today we're going to take a deep dive. We're really going to talk about different terms when it comes to sexual violence. I think a lot of times you hear that phrase sexual assault. Sexual violence and sexual assault are sort of different, and we're going to talk about that as we go along. We're going to talk about the continuum of violence a little bit, the stuff that leads up to sexual violence, talk about consent, what consent looks like, and talk about some legislation regarding that consent, because without consent, that's when sexual violence occurs. Talk about some statistics, some myths, some assumptions, some stereotypes, how those stereotypes are harmful. We'll talk a little bit about rape culture and how that lends itself to sexual violence. So we got a lot to get through. I think this program is going to be about 45 minutes without discussions. Usually when we do this in person, I like to put it out to folks. So let's take a look at the textbook definition of sexual violence. So the textbook definition of sexual violence is any unwanted sexual activity done against someone's will and without their consent. This can involve force and or coercion, and is based in power and control. So let's break this down just a little bit. Very similar to if you watch the domestic violence one, they have very similar definitions. Some of the important words in here: unwanted. Most important word, if it is not wanted by the receiver, the person receiving the actions, and we're going to talk about what those actions entail, et cetera, in a little bit. But if it is unwanted by the receiver, it's never how the person intends it. A lot of times we hear that, well, I was just joking, or I was just kidding, or I didn't mean to hurt you, that sort of stuff. If you don't want the actions that are happening, that is defined as sexual violence. It's unwanted by the receiver. Very simply, force and or coercion. We're going to really get into force and or coercion today and talk about what that is, and based in power and control. So when we look and talk about domestic violence, that is sort of the root of domestic violence, is someone trying to gain some sort of power, some sort of control over the other person. Very simply, same applies here. It is all about one person trying to gain some sort of power or control over another person, and using sex or something sexual as that tool to gain that power and control over that other person. So we're going to talk about sexual harassment, which is word-based, and we'll talk about other physical sexual violence. There is a range, there's a continuum, which I mentioned before. So that is the technical definition, the textbook definition that we use. As I said, there are all different things that fall under sexual violence. It's not just sexual assault. And so here is a little continuum. We're going to get more into this continuum a little later, but a lot of the things that fall under. So sexual exploitation, trafficking, cyber harassment, voyeurism, degrading sexual imagery, indecent exposure, stalking, sexual harassment, sexual assault or rape, sexual abuse, lots of things that fall under that umbrella of sexual violence. That's really what it comes down to, is that sexual violence is more of an umbrella term. Sexual violence is a term, it's not the correct grammar, but I always like to say that it's a social worky term. It is that umbrella that a lot of things fall under, whereas sexual assault is the legal term for that courts systems use for sexual assault and rape, or any unwanted sexual contact. So let's take a look. So sexual violence, like I said, done against someone's will without their consent, force or coercion. We talked about that. It's really important when we talk about, and I said this with domestic violence too, when we talk about sexual violence, anybody can be a perpetrator and anybody can be a victim or a survivor. Again, I'm going to use those terms interchangeably. Some people like to be referred to as a survivor, some as victims. So we use whatever that person prefers. So I'm going to use those interchangeably, but anyone can be a perpetrator, someone who commits the sexual violence, and anyone can be a victim or a survivor. It really doesn't have any specific gender or sexual orientation or race or ethnicity or economic status or age. It really can affect and does affect everyone in some way. So it's important to know that, because I think sometimes when we think about sexual violence, we think males committing sexual violence against females. Yes, that is higher numbers in the statistics that it does happen, but it can happen to anyone. So sexual violence, again, non-legal term, like I said, it's more inclusive than sexual assault, includes a lot of different things that we're going to talk about, including non-consensual image sharing, sexual harassment, voyeurism, some other things. Yeah, like I said, it encompasses a wide range of attitudes, beliefs, and actions, which can be said to contribute to a culture of violence. So we'll talk about that rape culture. When it comes to sexual violence, and I think I'm getting ahead of myself, it is similar to domestic violence in that it is sort of a snowball effect. Smaller things lead to bigger things, which lead to bigger things, which lead to bigger things. So it's important to cut the smaller things down here out. That's where what we call rape culture, getting way ahead of myself, where jokes and normalization of behaviors, if somebody thinks one thing is okay, they're going to think the next thing is okay, et cetera, et cetera. I'm getting way ahead of myself. So when it comes to types of sexual violence, what types of things fall under that umbrella? So these are the types of things that fall under that umbrella in the state of Connecticut. If you're watching in Norway, this may be different. But in the state of Connecticut, under sexual violence, rape, child sexual abuse, sexual harassment, depending on the situation. We'll talk about that. Exposure, voyeurism, and incest. Also sexual exploitation, trafficking, and stalking. So let's talk about each of these quickly. So when it comes to rape, this is the thing we think about, sexual assault. When we think about sexual violence, this is the thing that comes to mind first. It's a very specific form of sexual abuse defined by the FBI as penetration, no matter how slight, of a vagina or anus with any body part or an object. So that is a really important piece to take from that. That's why we usually use this definition, is that most people think it could rape or sexual assault is just one body part to another body part, but it could be an object as well. If that consent is missing, and it is, again, penetration without that consent. Child sexual abuse is any sort of sexual activity with a minor in the state of Connecticut that is technically 12 and under. When we talk about consent, I'll break down the ages of consent and things like that. But child sexual abuse is categorized as any sexual activity with anyone 12 and under. It doesn't need to be does not need to include physical contact between the perpetrator and the child. So there is a lot of other things that could be considered child sexual abuse. So exposing them to pornographic materials, or speaking to them in a sexual manner. A lot of things fall under that. And again, sometimes when we talk about sexual violence or domestic violence, people want that black and white of, well, what is this? What is that? It really is a case-by-case basis when it comes to this sort of thing. There's no real black and white of like, this is this and this is this. So it's important to remember that as we go forward. Sexual harassment, unwelcome verbal, visual, or physical conduct of a sexual nature that is pervasive or severe. So when it comes to sexual harassment, I like to say that is sexual in nature. So sexual or sexist in nature. That's an important thing. It could be sexual, having to do with sex specifically, or sexist, having to do with gender. So negative comments about gender. That's something that a lot of people don't realize falls under sexual harassment, is sexist comments or actions. So sexual or sexist, pervasive or severe. That's the other important piece of this, is this is an ongoing thing. It has happened more than once. It may have happened after you told that person to stop. You may have not told that person to stop. But again, if it is unwanted by that person, pervasive or severe. Severe could be considered something like stalking. Severe could be something like touching. That is where the line is between sexual harassment and sexual violence. Depending on the situation, sometimes inappropriate touching of, in the state of Connecticut, breast, buttocks, genitals, or inner thigh, that is base level sexual harassment, could also be considered sexual assault depending on the situation. Exposure. Exposure to inappropriate materials, flashing, exhibitionism, exposure to pornographic materials that are unwanted by the receiver. Again, it's important to remember it's the receiver, how they feel about what is happening. So if someone gets texted pictures without consent, so consent, that's why we'll dig into consent a little more in a few slides, but consent is so important, not just with physical activity, but with any sort of sexual activity that may fall under sexting, or even just comments, things like that. There should always be that consent, that other person is okay with it. So sharing of nude pictures, if that receiver does not want those pictures, that falls under exposure. Inappropriate materials, flashing, and exhibitionism. So flashing a body part that, from that list, breast, buttocks, genitals, or inner thigh, that under state of Connecticut law is considered exposure. And sexual assault in the 4th degree. I'm not a lawyer, but I think it's 4th degree. There's varying degrees, again, of sexual assault in the state of Connecticut. Voyeurism, gaining sexual pleasure from watching others, taking pictures. Very simply, that comes down to taking pictures, or videotaping someone engaging in sexual activity without that person's consent. It always comes back to consent, making sure that person is okay with it. Incest, marries, in the state of Connecticut, marries a person whom he knows to be related to him with any degrees of kindred, any of the degrees of kindred. So you can take a deep dive on that statute there. That's why I put that there. But very simply, relations with a family member, sexual activity with a family member. Sexual exploitation and sex trafficking, very similar. We have a whole training on sex trafficking that we can do that takes up a whole hour. But the base level when it comes to trafficking, it is sexual activity for the exchange of goods or services. very simple: sexual exploitation, sex trafficking, something of value, whether that is money, whether that is housing, whether that is food, that sort of thing. So that is sexual exploitation or sex trafficking. And it has to be through force, fraud, or coercion. So, and that person isn't doing this willingly. They feel like they have to, or they're not gonna have housing, or this their boyfriend or girlfriend are gonna break up with them, or they're not going to get food for the day, whatever it may be, through force, fraud, or coercion, and has not attained 18 years of age. But again, whole separate training that we can go into. Stalking, very simply, knowingly engages in behaviors, activities directed at specific person that would cause a reasonable person to fear for their physical safety or the physical safety of a third person, or suffered emotional distress. So very simply, texting that person all the time, causing them some sort of anxiety, showing up places where that person is, those kinds of things fall under stalking. So that is a very short list of things that fall under sexual violence in the state of Connecticut, but I'd like to show you this list because of the range of things on here. It is a spectrum. Like I said, there are smaller things that may be sexual harassment or verbal, which can lead to bigger things, leading to bigger things, which could lead to assault. So I got way ahead of myself. So sexual harassment, talked about it: unwanted, unwelcome, sexual or sexist, pervasive or severe. There are two types of, I'm going to break down everything we kind of talked about some more. Two types of sexual harassment that we see: quid pro quo, meaning this for that. So again, exchange for something. So sexual favors in exchange for money, raise, preferential treatment, that sort of thing. So there's either quid pro quo, that's the one we see less often than hostile environment. So this is what we see, and this is what we hear a lot in a work environment. When you hear about sexual harassment in a work environment, a lot of times it's this hostile environment. An environment is created where that person feels uncomfortable or are prevented from participating in activities due to ongoing harassment, sexual harassment, whether that is sexual comments, whether it's comments about their gender. They feel uncomfortable in the work environment, or whatever environment it may be. It may not just be the work environment. It could even be home. Hostile environment could also happen at home. Affirmative consent. Let's talk about consent, what it is. So affirmative consent is what we are looking to move over to. Back in the old days, I can't say that, but back in the 70s, 80s, when we had the sexual revolution, 60s, 70s, et cetera, the laws that were created around consent were only no means no. You probably grew up and that's what you heard. No means no. That was really drilled into folks, including myself, as we were growing up. That we have found is problematic because when it comes to sexual activity and giving consent, someone may not always say the word no. We found through studies that there's a variety of reasons why that person may not say no. They may be scared of retaliation. Frozen fright a lot of times happens. Again, getting ahead of myself with what we're talking about. There's a lot of reasons why that person may not say the word no. So what we are trying to do, even though the laws across the United States are still no means no centric for the most part, some states are changing. On the college campus level, they have all moved over to this affirmative consent. The yes means yes. So all policies on 99.999% of college campuses follow this affirmative consent, meaning only a yes is a yes. That's what affirmative consent means. Anything other than a yes is not a yes. Maybe, not a yes, or not a yes. Only a yes is a yes. That's where we're looking to shift things into the future, knowing without a doubt that that person is okay with it. So affirmative consent, knowing voluntarily and mutual decision among all participants to engage in a sexual activity. Recognized, like I said, all colleges and universities in Connecticut. It is not the law, like I said, right now, but Connecticut and most states are working towards changing the laws to reflect this. So consent can be given by words or actions as long as those words or actions create clear permission regarding willingness to engage in sexual activity. When I go into schools, I get students that say to me, well, having a conversation's weird. I don't want to talk about it. I just want to be able to do it. And that's great. But if nobody says anything, how do you know that the other person is okay with it? So I always like to say that consent is a combination of words and actions. So the word yes should be in line with how you are feeling, your emotions, how you're holding yourself, because there is a big difference between, yes, yeah, let's do this, and yeah, yes, big difference there. That second one would make me question things. It really comes down to communication. Very simply, it comes down to communicating with your partner. We always like to say 3 things when it comes to consent. It's an active process, it is a choice, and it is based on equal power. Let's break that down a little bit. Active process, it's ongoing, it's an ongoing conversation. Should be present each time and with each escalation. That boils down to just because somebody did something with you yesterday doesn't mean that they're okay doing it today or tomorrow or the next day. The other thing too is cannot be implied or suggested. Just because you are dating that person for 3 months or you're married to that person for 56 years doesn't necessarily mean that consent is always there. So again, having that conversation. Enthusiastic, again, enthusiastic and willing, that you know without a doubt that that other person is cool with what's happening. Verbal, nonverbal, I talked about that. Choice. So it must be a choice, meaning that that person must make the choice and say yes willingly. There should not be coercion or force. That person should never feel like they have to or something bad may happen. Whether that bad is that person may break up with them, or bad, maybe this person's going to hurt me. Again, that it should always be willing and enthusiastic. It's also important to know that consent can be withdrawn at any time. This is something I get into some really deep conversations with kids when we go into high schools of just because that person said yes at 6 o'clock or whatever, if let's say the sexual activity begins and everything's fine, and then one person feels uncomfortable, that person has the right to say, you know what, I don't want to do this. And the activity should stop, rather than, well, too bad, you already gave me consent. Not okay, not okay. Again, that consent can be withdrawn, and that person should respect the boundaries. Very simply, boundaries. We talked about that in healthy relationships last month. Again, and if they don't, that's where sexual violence occurs, is that person not listening to consent. And equal power. So it must be based on equal power. There are 3 main reasons in the state of Connecticut why someone cannot legally give consent to sexual activity. They are age of consent, intellectual disability, or alcohol or drugs. Let's talk about this. Age of consent. Oh, I usually have a board to write this on. Here's the thing. Age of consent in state of Connecticut is 16. 16, age of consent. At 16, at 16, that person can give consent to anyone 16 and above to engage in any sort of sexual activity. with that person. Every state is different. It is whatever state the sexual activity takes place in. It's not where you're from. I've gotten questions of like, well, it's 16 here, and what if I go to Las Vegas and it's 18 there? It's 16 for me. It's wherever the sexual activity takes place. And this is important when it comes to college campuses, because college students go all over the United States, and that age of consent is different. So it's important to know age of consent in the state that you're in. Now, I said age of consent is 16. And before I said that child abuse is 12. So what does that leave the 13, 14, 15, you might be asking? Well, if you're not, I'm still going to tell you. 13, 14, 15 in the state of Connecticut, while they cannot legally give consent, they can give consent, should be giving consent, not necessarily legally, to engage in sexual activity with someone within 3 years of that person's age. So a 13-year-old can engage in sexual activity with someone 13, 14, or 15. A 14-year-old can engage in sexual activity with someone 14, 15, or 16. A 15-year-old can engage in sexual activity with someone 15, 16, or 17. Here's the key phrase: without fear of prosecution. Meaning, for the most part, the state of Connecticut knows that if it's within those 3 years, that 3-year age difference, they're going to, for the most part, leave those folks alone. There are exceptions. Like I said, there's no black and white, and the age of consent is 16. But for the most part, they're going to leave it alone if it's within that 3-year age difference. If it is outside of that 3-year age difference, it is something that you probably have heard before, but didn't really know what it was applied to. Something called statutory rape. So that is what statutory rape is. That is a 13, 14, or 15-year-old engaging in sexual activity outside of that 3-year age gap. All right, I did that without the board for like the first time ever. I usually like to draw it out because we don't necessarily need to do that because the visual sometimes is really good. So when consent cannot be given, we talked about intellectual disability was the second one. So intellectual disability, if that person has a cognitive disability where they can't even understand the situation they are in, they cannot legally give that consent in the state of Connecticut. So what that is applied to in cases that I see most when that applies, we don't see a lot of that, but it is things like Alzheimer's or dementia, where that person doesn't even understand the situation they are in. So that is the intellectual disability, and victim is impaired. The other reason is victim is impaired or incapacitated due to drugs or alcohol. Alcohol is a drug. Alcohol and other drugs. There we go. So this is really important in the state of Connecticut to know. Most states are like this as well. If there are, that's the plural, if there are drugs or any sort of alcohol in someone's system, they cannot legally consent to sexual activity. Now, usually when I say that in a group, people's minds are blown and they're like, what? What? Well, I can't even just like have a glass of wine? What? You can have a glass of wine. Technically, under the law, if there are drugs or alcohol in that person's system, it is considered that person cannot consent. But what if both people are drinking? What if one person is drinking? The question I get a lot, what if both people are drinking? I'm not saying that every time there are drugs or alcohol involved, it is sexual assault or sexual violence, but you run that risk because of Connecticut state laws, technically. And those alcohol and other drugs, it's not like I took a Tylenol. Not those kind of drugs. So it's important to know that. All right, victim is unconscious. We talked about that. Age of consent, we talked about that. Victim is under 18 and offender is responsible for general supervision. So that is where that power dynamic also comes into play. is if the victim is under 18 and the person engaging in sexual activity has some sort of power over them. So like a teacher or a coach, something like that, or a boss, those types of things, not okay. Consent cannot be given in that situation. It would be considered a sexual assault or sexual violence. Victim is incarcerated or in a hospital. That's not how to say that. Hospital. There we go. Offender, medical exam, offender. So again, school employee, coach, or person provides ongoing instruction. These are the nitty gritty of the details in the state of Connecticut law. You can take a look at this. You can freeze your YouTube. I'm like 100. Freeze your YouTube. What? Pause it if you want to really look at these types of things. But these, I went over the main reasons when consent cannot be given in those situations. Let's take a look at some statistics and some prevalence. So again, I'm not going to read all these statistics out, but there are some, 1 in 5 women have been raped in their lifetime. 1 in 71 men have been raped in their lifetime. Let's see, 1 in 4 bisexual women and 1 in 8 lesbian women will experience sexual violence. The reason we have this up here is, again, to stress that it can happen to anyone. And when it comes to the BIPOC community, LGBT community, they experience sexual violence at a higher rate because of many different vulnerabilities. So it's important to recognize that that happens at a higher rate to some sometimes more vulnerable populations. So when it comes to sexual violence, most sexual assaults are committed by someone that that victim knows. I think the number is, oh yeah, there it is. 80% of sexual assaults are acquaintance rapes, meaning that it's someone that person knows. When we think of sexual violence, we usually think, well, it's somebody jumping out from behind a tree or a guy with a white van. 9 times out of 10, or 80% really, it is someone that that victim knows, a friend of a friend, an acquaintance, a family member. And this is usually when I put that question out to the audience of, why do you think that is? And the reason that is the case is, again, that the vulnerability, I shouldn't use that word in this presentation if I can't say it, that access to that person, that trust that someone puts in that person. Like I said, most of the time when it comes to sexual violence, it is coercion, making that person feel like they have to or feel bad if they don't. So again, a lot of times friends, family members can make someone, can more easily manipulate someone into doing something that they don't necessarily want to do. So again, most of the time it is someone that that person knows. Now, I'm not saying be scared of your friends, but what I am saying is just realize that it's not like on Law and Order, it's not just a random stranger or attack. Sometimes that happens, but more often than not, it is someone that in that person's circle, because they know how to have access to that person and that trust is there. Reporting rates, like I said before, these statistics here are based on reports. We know that people are less likely to report something like this. So we think that these numbers are much higher. Sexual abuse and sexual violence is one of the most underreported crimes for many reasons. Some of the reasons are embarrassment. They don't necessarily want people in their towns, well, I think we're getting to that slide, or the people around them know that this happened, so they keep it to themselves. Fear of retribution if they report it to someone. That person that may have committed the sexual violence will try to hurt them again. Lots of different reasons why someone does not report this, this type of thing. Over 90% of sexual assault survivors on a college campus do not report the assault. There is something on college campuses called the Clery Act, where college campuses have to report every single year all of the crimes on the campus. Sexual assaults, violence, domestic violence situations, just normal violence situations, muggings, things like that. And the Cleary report, they put that out every year, just so you can be informed on what is happening on college campuses. This is really a nice resource tool for folks if they have kids going to college to take a look at that. Now, the thing with that is you would probably go on the Cleary report and go, all right, I'm going to find a college that has 0 reported sexual assaults and 0 reported domestic violence. That is not necessarily a good thing. What that says to us advocates is that the culture on this campus is one that does not allow or doesn't foster reporting. Or people feel unsafe reporting. We know that sexual assault will occur, especially in college settings, because again, more vulnerable population. So it's important. Sometimes when you see those higher numbers, in the state of Connecticut, the last I checked, some of the colleges that had higher numbers were Yale, I think Connecticut College, I forget these specifics, but again, that goes to show you right there that the population feels more comfortable reporting that sort of thing. So again, arrest, prosecution, and convictions, when it comes to that, this is a very sad graphic. So let's say that 310 are reported sexual violence, sexual assaults are reported to the police. 57 of those may lead to an arrest. Probably only 11 of those will get referred to a prosecutor. Probably 7 of those will only get a conviction. And out of those 7, 6 maybe might be incarcerated. So it's a long process. And it's a hard process when it comes to arrest and prosecution, but that should never deter someone if they want to report that sort of thing, because justice looks different for everyone. There is no right or wrong way. I'm getting ahead of myself again. When it comes to justice for sexual violence, some people want to see someone, their assailant, incarcerated. Some don't. Some want that person to get help for whatever problem they may have. There's a lot of different things. Some don't even want to worry about that perpetrator. They want to take care of themselves. And that's really an important piece of that. So rape culture, I'm going to just talk about rape culture quickly. This is what allows sexual violence to sort of happen. I don't mean to say it that bluntly, but it is that bottom of that snowball. So it is creating an environment where these sorts of behaviors and things are okay. So what happens is people joke about it, people normalize it, they minimize it. Oh, I'm sure in your lifetime you have heard someone make some sort of a rape joke, or maybe connected to the prison system or things like that. Again, those sorts of things normalize it, normalize these behaviors, and oh, it's just a joke, ha 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 ha, when in fact it's not. So it's really important to call this sort of stuff out when we see it. Like I said, way down here at the small snowballs before they become the big snowballs. So rape culture, this normalization of, again, societal attitudes and that sort of stuff, how it affects survivors and victims of sexual violence, they are less likely to report or seek help. Like I said before, there is that stigma about this. And a lot of times the stigma is that, well, this is the victim's fault. It's really important to know, I should have said this way back at the very beginning, sexual violence is never the victim's fault. No one chooses for this to happen to them. So less likely to report, affects the way they view their assault. Again, if these sorts of things get minimized, that person feels like, well, if inside it's a huge deal to that person, and it may be, if they're hearing from the outside, well, it's not a big deal. There may be conflicting, there may be anxiety, lots of different ways, small town paranoia, like I said, cultural conflicts, victim, if not random cultures, but cultures are saying that these sorts of behaviors are okay, when in fact that person, it's not okay. That conflict is there. Identity crisis, loss of hope. It can impact their ability to concentrate on schoolwork, their relationships, regular, if they have jobs, their work, lots of different ways. I always like to say to victims and survivors, there's no right way or wrong way to react. However that person reacts is the right way for them. It is never that victim's fault. It's important to know that there are systems in place for help. That is why the Brookfield Library has brought me here. It is important to know that there is help out there. There are so many options for help. There is help like the Women's Center, or there is mental help if you need counseling, things like that. There is the police department. The police department are there if you would like to report. The hospitals are there. They can do something called a forensic evidence collection kit. If you feel like you have been assaulted, within 120, you have 120 hours, I think 120 hours, it has changed to 120 hours from the time you feel you were assaulted to go to the hospital if you want to. Again, no one is saying you have to, but going to the hospital, getting a forensic evidence collection kit, used to be called a rape kit, but they've changed it because rape kit had that stigma, and people did not go to the hospital to get that kit done because they were like, well, I don't want to identify as this. It's sort of, that's a scary word. Rape, sexual assault is a scary thing. So forensic evidence collection kit can be any gender, male, female, any gender can go get that done. What that does is collects evidence off of the body, puts it all in a box. In the event that you want to go to the police, you have physical evidence. Again, don't have to go to the police, don't have to go to the hospital, don't have to get help. And again, sometimes I have victims and survivors sometimes say to me, years after they decide to come get help, and they're like, I didn't get a forensic evidence collection kit. I didn't report to the police, and that's okay. In that moment that was happening, that's how that person dealt with it. And again, however you deal with sexual violence and it is okay. And there's no right or wrong way. So how can we help others? How can we help others? Not telling them what they should do. This is very much like domestic violence where you're talking about, not telling what that person should do, saying you should go to the hospital, you should file a police report, you should go to the Women's Center. That is not helpful. What is helpful is just being there for that person, being a support system for that person, reminding them of their strengths, courage, giving them options, helping them explore their options, saying, the hospital's available if you want to go there. The Women's Center can help you with options, not saying you should. So again, just being a support system, that is sometimes the best thing that you can do. I know if somebody came to me saying that this has happened, it might be, well, for me, I do this work, so I know the different things that need to be done. But for someone who doesn't do this work, that can be overwhelming. That can be like, what do? I want to help this person, but I also don't want to mess it up. Just being there, listening to them, saying, hey, I'm here if you need me, is a huge thing, and an important first step in that. Prevention. So when it comes to prevention, there are two kinds of things we like to talk about in sexual violence prevention: primary prevention versus risk reduction. Primary prevention is really what we are shifting to. It is stopping sexual violence before it happens through education, this program right here, educating on people on what it looks like, how to help, addressing these things. And education is the base. We always like to say here at the Women's Center, an educated community is a safer community. So that is primary prevention, saying stopping it before it happens. What the culture surrounding sexual violence has been up to very recently is this risk reduction culture, basically putting it on that person, putting it on the victim, on the survivor, saying, well, why were you wearing that? Or you have to take care of yourself from being assaulted. That's not okay. No one chooses to be assaulted. So we are shifting from this risk reduction. In colleges, when I was growing up and my parents were growing up, it was, well, get a rape whistle or mace, to etc. Those are risk reduction methods, basically saying it's on you to stop this, where that's not okay. We really need to shift the conversation to, we need to educate and stop sexual violence before it even happens, and not put that onus on victims and survivors. So very simply, bystander intervention. What can you do if you see this sort of stuff happen? Very simply, empowering others around you to be upstanders, what we call an upstander. Step in a situation. And I know this isn't easy. This isn't an easy thing. If you see a sexual violence happening or sexual harassment happening, it's usually like, well, it's none of my business. I don't need to take care of that. But it really is on all of us to do something or say something to stop all of this. From the 70s, there was a case, the Kitty Genovese case, that some people may be familiar with. This is more of a domestic violence case, but it applies here in this situation. Kitty Genovese in New York City in the 70s was murdered in front of her apartment building, and 39 people witnessed this. Not a single one of them called the police. And then later they were all interviewed, and they said to the police asked, well, why didn't you call the police? And they said, well, I thought somebody else would call. I thought my neighbor would call, et cetera, et cetera. And no one ended up calling. That's why it's so important to really take that on with us. So how do we do that? We can report things if we're at work. We can report things to HR if we see sexual harassment situations out in the real world. We can report things to the police, local authorities. Very base level, we can challenge sexist jokes, comments, challenge those rape culture things that we're talking about. When we see them or hear them, not laughing along, saying, hey, that's not cool. Don't say that. Very simply, that's a really wonderful first step. Really stepping in, asking someone if they're okay. Sometimes if we see a situation happen, we ourselves may freeze up and be like, oh, I don't know what to do in that moment. But if the moment passes, going up to that person afterwards, if you see something happen at work and say, hey, I saw what happened. Is everything okay? I'm here if you want to talk. Being that support system, very simple. Like I said, we are here. The Women's Center is here. There are so many options and resources out there. This will be up there, up on the YouTube. My email, if you want to send me, if you have questions, comments, concerns, I can't do two things at once. There we go. Questions, comments, concerns. My email is matthew.a@wcogd.org. You can Google the Women's Center website. All my information is up there. You can find me if you have questions or you want to get a hold of us. Thank you, Rachel, for having us. This was really great. And we got a lot. I packed a lot of information in a short amount of time. I could do a deep dive on every single one of these slides if I wanted to, but this was a 101. Maybe we'll do a 102.
There you go. Perfect. Well, I really want to thank you again for doing this and for doing this whole series with us. And I'm really so pleased that we're able to present this to people. As Matt had mentioned, we have another one coming up. It's on sexual harassment. And that's scheduled to take place on March 10th at 7 p.m. And that, like the others, will be streamed live to YouTube, or live streamed, I guess is the proper term, to YouTube, and will be archived on the Brookfield Library YouTube page for people to look at any time. So, so thank you so much.